Hello and welcome to this week's COVID-19 Shared Mobility Briefing. I'm Venkatesh Gopal from MoveMe. I hope you're charged up for today's topic. We're talking about EV charging, and I'm joined none other than Suzanne Goldberg, Director of Policy from ChargePoint. Suzanne, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks. I'm charged up too.
Great. Talking about EV charging, the infrastructure side is gaining so much of its much-deserved importance in the recent times. And now that we move into the post-pandemic era, most of the cities are becoming increasingly used to, the clean air around for a change. As experts in the charging infrastructure industry, obviously you would have dealt with vehicle fleets, you've dealt with shared fleets, worked with so many cities, indicating that you need to, if there is a new idea, you need to marry both ends together and then show every angle how this new idea or a new concept makes complete sense, right? So speaking about policies, what are the policy changes that you've seen so far or expect in these times to come from cities' standpoint to support such efforts of fleets?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think you touched on a really interesting point about, what's fairly obvious from, picking up the newspaper and seeing the satellite images of, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and just seeing, and then, global cities, the dramatic increase in air quality. And, although there's been, devastating impacts from COVID and on our communities, I think, that might be, if we can call it a bright spot, one bright spot that's resulted from the pandemic. And it's been interesting because it's allowed us to experience what our world would be like if, we didn't have air pollution from vehicles and fewer cars on the road. And, it's kind of a proxy for EVs. And we believe that a future with cleaner air can be realized. And a large part of that can be achieved with electric mobility. And, before getting to your point about policy, I just wanted to provide some additional, context in terms of how I think the policy is and where, from our interactions with municipal governments, how we see them thinking about this. I think, the emergency orders, shelter in place, as we've just said, significant reductions in air pollution and improvements in air quality. And what's interesting to me about this is kind of something really tangible and in a sense, serving as a proxy for what what our communities would feel like or look like with widespread EV adoption, and not just passengers, but shared mobility and transit. And why this is particularly interesting for me, my background before joining ChargePoint was in behavioral economics and energy modeling, and it's all about what motivates people and businesses to make a change. And it's really understanding the problem and the solution. And climate change and GHG emissions are really intangible concepts. And so seeing these dramatic increases in air quality has kind of made some, a problem or an impact, from intangible to tangible. And, so in some ways, while this dramatic reduction in vehicles on the road, buses on the road is, not long-term, but it really does symbolize what our communities would look like. And I think the impact of this is that it could lead to increased support for actions at a local level, and empower municipalities to execute on their climate plans. And EVs obviously play a significant role in that, because, we look at municipal emissions, quarter to a third or more in a municipality, those emissions come from transportation. And if we look at the emissions reduction potential, just in Canada, when we compare an EV to a conventional vehicle, emissions reductions are just over 50 to 98%, depending on where you live. So coming back to the comment about policy, pre-COVID, and I'm sure you have seen this, but it seemed like pre-COVID every week a new city, municipality, district was declaring climate emergency and really naming the problem and defining some of those solutions, which include goals, strategies, and policies towards electrification. And what we're seeing is local governments are staying the course with their climate commitments, a number of them, and calling out this real reduction in this tangible and real reduction in air quality is kind of an indicator of what can be achieved, and all of this, I'll say, fits within the context of what you acknowledge, that cities have had significant impacts from COVID. So they're supporting residents and businesses, their resources and finances are reduced, but what we've observed is that municipalities are not deprioritizing climate and EVs, but really reassessing and the scope, delivery, and timing of the execution of their plans. And I think City of Vancouver, they had a recent staff presentation this July on, updating on the climate emergency response, and I think they summed it up really nicely. And so they said, in many ways, the COVID pandemic has really heightened the need for bold climate action, but bold climate action needs to be sensitive to this new reality. And maybe I'll provide one or two more anecdotes on that piece. We also hosted a webinar recently, and two participants were city councillors from Toronto and BC, and both regions, they have ambitious climate policies to begin with, so we're coming from that baseline. But they did notice that COVID has presented an opportunity for them to stay the course, but more broadly to step back, and it's given them pause. Like how can they really affect change with EVs and other modes of mobility? And they also, like City of Vancouver, acknowledge that their climate plans moving forward need to recognize, some shifts in their new reality. And so some of the themes that I took away from that are, an increased focus on equity. So how did they weave that into their plans? And when we're talking about charging infrastructure, are we ensuring that charging infrastructure is really, addressing all the communities, and are we filling in the gaps? They're also looking at their constrained budgets and seeing, we have these plans for investments in infrastructure. What can we do now? What can we delay? And what are innovative financing mechanisms we could look to fund this? So one example is, looking at a combined goal of supporting electric vehicle adoption and infrastructure to support passenger vehicles and car share vehicles. So can a city put in a charging station that has two ports, one that serves a car share vehicle and one that serves, the community? And, perhaps that's an innovating financing model that you pull on money from provincial or federal programs. So there's that. And then I think they're also looking at, we don't know what's happening in the long term with our mobility patterns shifting, but we do know now people are working from home more. Yeah. They're, using transit less. And at least in the Metro Vancouver area, what we've heard from car share companies is that there's, at the height of the pandemic, there was a reduction in all of those mobility modes, but rebounding on car share and perhaps ride hailing at a much faster pace than transit. So given these goals of electric mobility and reduced transportation emissions from these large cities in Canada, these policies that were already part of their plans, looking at how they can support these modes of transportation, I think, continue to be on the agenda, but perhaps are being looked at as solutions that might get reprioritized in terms of where action is taken. And I'll just say one more point on that in terms of policies. I think another interesting piece is, they're, in addition to innovative financing tools, because municipalities do have a really important role to play in deploying and supporting infrastructure, they also have a really important role to play in regulatory tools and non-financial policy incentives. And given resource constraints, regulatory tools, kind of rise to the service as key action. So I think those will continue to be an important role in these municipal policies as they move forward. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk about some, I guess, examples of where we've seen a number of municipalities across Canada.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's surprising or reassuring that there's been a number of announcements both on the policy side and investment side related to EVs in this pandemic, height of the pandemic, but moving forward, that I think signify, these municipal commitments continuing, provincial and federal support for these investments, and then a continued commitment to policy development. So I'll just mention a couple there. One, as I mentioned, City of Vancouver, they're moving forward with their climate action response plans, and in November they're going to council with an update. City of Vancouver and Saanich just introduced and passed building codes for EV readiness, so essentially making it easier and cheaper for individuals who are living in condos and apartments or commercial enterprises to install EV charging in the future. A number of cities, Halifax, District of Saanich, moving forward with EV strategies and climate plans. And then what's been really interesting to me, even or in spite of significant decreases in ridership and loss of revenue from transit agencies, is no slowing down in these bold commitments that transit agencies across Canada have made. So Kingston, City of Oakville, Oakville is installing 32 EV charging stations and 16 e-buses. Kingston has $1.6 million for the purchase of vehicles and charging infrastructure. City of Brampton, Guelph. So all of this is really, I think, symbolic of this continued commitment there.
Yeah, that's great because as director of policy, you not only are able to look at certain cities, but then your perspective goes wide across Canada. So great examples there. A couple of points that you mentioned there. You talked about shared mobility and how the charging infrastructure would be considered. There will be a slightly different approach in how individual cars or electrification would be taking place. And then you mentioned the condo and the strata part there. And then also there is shared mobility in the fleets, which here's what, and also interesting that you mentioned ride hailing, because I certainly feel that overall in shared mobility there is we knew that convenience was the number one consideration when it comes to shared mobility because of access. Now, post-pandemic, in our survey that we did last month, we realized that it was something to do with health and hygiene. And then health and hygiene has two pieces. So there is like physical distancing, and then there is disinfection of the services. One more likely than the other, but perception-wise, everything is just health and hygiene for the user. So when it comes to coming back to shared mobility and ride-hailing in specific, how do these efforts fit into the mixed business model which Lyft and Uber have? Because when we talk about electrifying ride-hailing or efforts to ensure or policies to mandate ride-hailing to get electrified, they don't have fleets per se. So they are dependent on the users who have EVs. But how does that work? And how do you think that fits into the efforts of the city electrifying infrastructure there?
Yeah, I mean, what's been so interesting for me working at ChargePoint, and I think what is such a benefit from a policy perspective is, not only have we been in business for 12 years, so we've seen it all, but we design and develop and help deploy charging solutions in almost every vertical of electric mobility, and so that gives us a really unique perspective in terms of understanding a lot of these dynamics and really understanding what drivers and fleets need. So coming back to what you're talking about, what's so unique about the ride-hailing model is that it's in some sense a fleet, and in some sense an individual driving their vehicle. So it's a unique combination. So what has been so helpful for me, and I think what's great is we get to leverage the learning from fleets and passenger vehicles from a policy perspective, but also looking at it from a solutions perspective about how we best support these fleets. And it is really interesting that you're trying from the municipal perspective, you're trying to transition a fleet which has a number of individual actors. And so from the municipal perspective, I think there's two components from which they can engage, and it's policies that support the shift, but also, what you mentioned is supporting infrastructure, and access to infrastructure is a really critical piece, and ensuring that the vehicle is able to deliver passengers from point A to B is fundamental to the business model and fundamental to the individual driver making money. And so there really is a need for conveniently located charging stations. And what we've learned from working in this space and working with the municipalities is there's, it's not, one size fits all solution. There's a need for conveniently located fast charging infrastructure, and it's a strategic locations like airports, event locations. Some of this infrastructure can be shared with public, so there's that combined benefit or innovative financing model that we talked about earlier. But then in addition to that, there's other charging locations where drivers need access to, and that is perhaps level 2 charging at home or near their home, overnight. These are passenger vehicles and not going to a depot, so it's this interesting dynamic of looking at fuel like a fleet. They need to have reliable access to fuel, but also fueling in some sense like a fleet at some point, but also their passenger vehicles, so they have access to charging at home or near their home, which can really improve the experience of the driver. And I think you touched on this. It is very different concept from a fleet charging in a depot, and there's some policies that cities have deployed, and some that I that they're looking at deploying. Again, because I'm based in Vancouver, I'm drawing a lot on these Metro Vancouver examples, but Metro Vancouver, for example, 23 mayors. There's an intermunicipal license for ride hailing. There's one fee, I believe it's $150 licensing fee per vehicle. That drops down to $30 for EV. So, an incentive there. City of Vancouver has a surcharge for trips that are ending or beginning in the city. That fee is reduced for EVs. So that's one component, and you had already, mentioned some other policies that have not necessarily made their way to North America yet, but looking at low emission zones or mandates like in California, which look at how to reduce emissions and move towards electrification in the entire, ride-hailing fleet. And those are, all companion pieces. There's the vehicle component, and then there's the infrastructure component. And just coming from the perspective of the infrastructure provider and just understanding the needs of drivers, that's a really critical piece. And where municipalities can perhaps affect the most change is looking at those policies. And yeah.
Yeah, sure.
So I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool. You did mention about the fast charging level 2, level 3. Which one do they prefer? What there could be different mix and matches in what kind of access and financial models that you develop, how those are paid, non-paid. So in general, just a word, do you see DC fast chargers or fast chargers in general picking up, going up? Because even though the range anxiety is becoming a thing of the past, it's still something that we have been used to from all our other gadgets, which are powered by electricity. And it just seems that it's going to be the next thing. And by default, every other charging station would be fast, if not super fast. So do you see that that's already being preferred in the policy side? That cities are like, we need at least like 30% fast chargers when it comes to like deploying or setting those kind of limitations. Are there something like that?
It's interesting. Fueling with an EV is fundamentally different than fueling with your with your combustion vehicle. And I think you mentioned some interesting and important trends. The vehicle batteries are getting larger, and also people are fueling in different locations in cities. And I really respect the way cities are those who are kind of leading in this space are looking at it. They'll deploy them stations and exit level 2 in DC, and they really engage in studies to understand how EV drivers charge. And so I think there's maybe 2 or 3 key points here. While we're used to this fueling model, I go to the gas station, I fuel up for 5 minutes or so, maybe I clean my windows. Never happens. But that is the way we're fueling. But what's so convenient about electric fueling is, we're now fueling where we park, and so we're not standing there with a hose. We're fueling where we park. Okay. So the majority of fueling is happening overnight in people's homes, or if you're in a centrally managed fleet in a depot, or you're a car share, in a depot or at that spot. And so, I don't not having there's a role for faster charging in specific use cases, highway charging, certain type of fleet applications, ride hailing during the day. But I think the fundamental advantage and the way the consumer behavior of charging where you park is something that's going to be and continue to be fundamental to the EV experience. So there is a role for both our level 2 charging stations and our DC in our communities, and I see cities really embracing and understanding that, and then calling out the specific use cases for those different charging applications. Some are saying, okay, well, we're going to have fast charging hubs to serve people who don't have access to home charging, or to serve car share or free floating car share or ride hail. But we're also going to look at EV-ready building codes and see how we make it cheaper and easier for commercial developments and residential developments to have level 2 charging at home. So it's a mix. It's nuanced. I guess it's like an engineering answer. There's no one answer. It's somewhere in between. But that's the perspective on that question. But it was a great question.
I love it, because that's fundamentally, as somebody who's been following EVs and trying to find business cases everywhere, I feel that that's the one thing that sets electric vehicles apart from any other fueling vehicles, because we get electricity right to our doorstep, and we use electricity for everything else at home. So I almost am tempted to end the interview at that note, but then I still have one more question to go. So when we're talking about we talked about policies, we talked about fleets, we talked about charging stations, which ones to prefer. So if you had to round up on maybe 3 or 4 best practices or best practice policies in EV charging infrastructure, so there you could have had best policies pre-COVID, like by March, and then now after like 6 months, has your ranking changed in terms of what are the best practices in policies?
Yeah, it's a great question, and yeah, I'm thinking if it has. I don't really I don't know if policy my hit list is my policy hit list. My top. I don't think it's changed. And I say that because one, in the context of COVID, I electric mobility, clean fuel. I think it's a critical part of our recovery and investment in infrastructure and related EV products and services contributes to our economy. And a recent BC study came out on the impact of the ZEV sector, and we've seen almost doubling in kind of employment investment impacts. And if we just take EV charging, it takes anywhere from 150 to 400 plus hours of person job hours to install a charging station. So I see that as a really fundamental part of our green resilient recovery. And so policies that support investment in infrastructure, and I'm going to focus on infrastructure for my policy hit list because that's a perspective in which I approach the sector. I think it complements where we are today with the conversation around COVID. And so, my policy hit list is looking at ways to make it easier and cheaper and less complex for the future installation of charging stations in multifamily dwellings, residential dwellings, and commercial enterprises. So that includes the EV rated building codes I talked about, also policies that provide people who live in condos or stratas the right or ability to charge within that context. I also add to that policies that improve the business case and make the investment more attractive in electrical, infrastructure to support EVs and also EV charging stations themselves. So it's a combination of incentives and then looking at what role the utilities can play with providing some of that basic electrical infrastructure, or looking at rates that make the investment more attractive. So this includes looking at demand charges and how those can be structured to better facilitate investment, and also energy rates. And then my last two, I think clean fuel programs like the one that's being proposed at the federal level, the clean fuel standards, and provincially the low carbon fuel standards. These, without getting into too much policy detail, essentially some long-term policy signals that say, we want reductions in the emissions intensity of our fuel, and there's a financial incentive linked to the provision of lower carbon fuels in the market, and so that financial incentive and kind of stimulates investment. And then lastly, I think a policy that will also be critical to investment in EV charging infrastructure is, and this is maybe a little more on the wonky side, but ensuring that our station owners have options in terms of the pricing they provide to drivers. And one fundamental option is being able to charge drivers for the energy they use. And so, there's some shifts at the federal level and utility commission level across provinces that need to occur to enable that as a pricing option. So that priority list hasn't changed, but I think much like the municipalities, it's just the lens of, okay, well, I think equity is really important. We need to keep that into consideration and really respond to the shifting mobility patterns we're seeing. But I think this policy hit list really serves all those shifting needs there.
Great. Yeah. The point about equity and charging rates pretty much hit home, in the sense of just because you have electricity available doesn't mean that we use all of it. it's energy at the end of the day, and sustainability is very much linked to energy than it's to any other consumption of goods, so to speak. So yeah, I just want to keep going with this interview. There's so much that I wanted to ask you. I guess we could do something of this sort again. And thank you so much, Suzanne. I'm sure there will be so much for us to link back and reach out and see how EVs charging infrastructure in this post-COVID world makes more sense towards sustainability. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. And thank you all for joining. See you next week. Bye bye.
Thanks.